Welcome to the Narrator Roundtable. I'm Kirt Graves. Joining me today, we have a few of my co-hosts. Just to kind of put the podcast in a place and time, we are recording this the week after the election in the United States. So I am going to welcome my co-hosts and not ask them how they're doing. So welcome, Lindsey. Hello.
Thank you, Kirt. I feel so welcomed.
I'm really happy to see you. André, I'm equally happy to see you. No, shoot, I can't even stop myself from doing it.
He's so Midwestern.
How are the streets of New York City?
They're doing so good. They could be more paved, but that's what taxes are for. So happy to be here. Thank you.
All right.
I was also wondering about the streets, so thank you.
And from the other coast, Deanna is joining us. Hello, Deanna. Welcome.
Hello. I'm happy to be here.
It's always wonderful to see you. So I was a speech and debate kid, and then I was a coach and an adjudicator for 15 years. So I spent nearly 2 decades making fun of cliches in speeches. And I just want everyone to know that I know what I'm about to sound like when I say, Merriam-Webster defines community as a unified body of individuals, such as people with common interests living in a particular area, a social state or condition, joint ownership or participation, and society at large. However you want to define community, what community means isn't nearly as important as what community means to us as individuals. That is an example of a bad speech introduction. That's a great podcast introduction, by the way. This podcast would not exist if it weren't for the innate human desire to be part of a larger group of people who share some common interests and experiences. And sometimes those groups occur naturally, and other times we have to make a conscious effort to build community. We have often praised the narrator community for being welcoming and generous, but how was that community built? How do we safeguard these safe spaces as they grow exponentially each year? How do we avoid becoming the industry equivalent of the high school cafeteria where you pick your table and stay there? To help us break down these questions, and probably more, we are so excited to welcome a very special guest host to the podcast today. The narrator of over 700 titles, including Earphones, Voice Arts Award, and Audie Award winners, our guest host today has worked in the audiobook world for 15 years. In addition to narration, she has produced and directed many titles and is the founder of Narrator.life, providing courses, coaching, and community for narrators at all levels of their careers. She has been mentioned on this podcast no less than a dozen times. And so it is our pleasure to finally welcome Andi Arndt to the Narrator Roundtable. Welcome, Andi.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We are excited to have you. So we are talking about community, but a quick disclaimer before we jump into the conversation. At the Narrator Roundtable, we strive to lift our colleagues up and celebrate their expertise and talent. But we don't typically endorse any one coach, organization, or educational program. However, it's only natural to include that work in our conversation when someone joins us at the roundtable who is a coach or has created a coaching community like Andi has. So just putting it out there, I know several of us have coached with Andi one-on-one. Several of us are members of the Narrator.life network. We're going to end up talking about it, but as always, we encourage you, dear listener, to do your research, seek recommendations from people that you trust, and think carefully about where you want to invest your time, money, and emotional energy when it comes to training. So, now that that's out of the way, I'm curious to hear from each of you in a few sentences what your experience in the narrator community has been, how long it took for you to feel like you were a part of the community, and if there was a moment that really made that sense of community click into place for you. So Andi, since you're new to us, do you want to go first?
Sure. I took a workshop early on, but once I had kind of done everything that was recommended I do from that workshop, I did kind of feel stuck. And so I asked Pat Fraley, who was the person that I studied with, what should I be doing? I feel like I've kind of maxed out what I can do. And he said, well, you got to start showing up at stuff. You got to go to this, you got to go to that, you got to go to the lobster bake. And I was like, lobster bake? I like lobsters. And so I researched my way to my first lobster bake, and that's really where I felt, I see a community at work here.
Yeah. How about you, André?
I love that. I started and did my first ACX book without even knowing that there were like Facebook pages even about audiobook narration. And so, yeah, that first project was kind of in isolation. And then I found, like the ACX narrators page, the indie narrators page, etc. And that was a little scattered, but I do feel a sense of alignment there, Andi. I feel like first virtually, I remember all those kind of like the clubhouse rooms, and then you start seeing the same familiar faces, and then the conversations start moving into DMs, and you start kind of building one-on-one connections with people. And then those loop back when you're, in the Zoom room, the first like APA in-person event since I started during the pandemic. I think that kind of circle of connectivity and community with people was when I started feeling like, oh, like this is the place. These are where all the people are, Someone who was my favorite narrator, like drops out of the sky and then we're just eating a croissant. And then, we're people in place. So I think that was kind of my journey with that.
Yeah. How about you, Deanna?
Well, I'm a COVID convert, if you want to say that. So that's how I got in, basically by having the time. And I just used that time to do nothing else but immerse myself into audiobooks and the education part in my practice, and also in listening, as well as gathering information. So I was virtually on Clubhouses. There were different Zooms and whatnot that happened. I joined every Facebook group that I could find. So for me, it was instantaneous. Like I just literally dove into the deep end. Like I joined the APA and just like sat there and absorbed everything and went to everything and did all the socials before I got really active. I mean, I was an ambassador because I was like, that's the only thing I feel comfortable doing because I don't know what this is yet. But I was like, people were so nice to me when I came. I was like, I can do that. So yeah, just immediately, I would say. And if you want to talk about like maybe the reverse of that, do you know what I mean? It's like the more you know, and regardless of kind of how you see yourself, I'm finding the more people I know and the more connections I have, I'm starting to get classified. I'm starting to get put into, little boxes or, like ticking little categories. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. And you know what I mean? Like, yes, and you know what I mean? So that's an interesting journey, to kind of be
let's
like, right?
Yeah, let's definitely unbox that a little bit more. But
I love the
first,
unbox.
Yeah, we're gonna come back to that. And but it's funny because
instantaneously was my answer.
It's funny because hearing you talk about Clubhouse reminds me that the first time I ever saw your little profile picture and heard you talk was during Andi's Friday Clubhouse.
Oh yeah.
Chats. Like I was like, oh yeah, that's right. That's how I first knew Deanna, was from those chats in those rooms.
Do you know what I mean? That those were like the extracurriculars. It was like I would be in class, I would be studying things, I'd be listening to other people's work, I'd be watching tons of stuff on YouTube, and then Fridays at noon, I was like, yeah, I'll get my lunch, and it was that kind of thing, like it felt like extracurricular because we were just chatting. Some of it was business, some of it was technique, but it really was people talking and communing. And so, yeah. I agree.
Yeah. Lindsey, how about you?
Yeah, I started a little scattershot. I took a very quick course here in Chicago, but I didn't really feel connected to any sort of community just from that one experience. And then, like André, I slowly started researching and finding the Facebook groups, and that was helpful. But what really, two things really flipped the switch for me. One was 2019 APAC, which was my first time going to that, where I met Kirt and Gail and like ran around like a chicken with my head cut off for a couple days and felt so overwhelmed. But like it was my first time being physically present with other audiobook people. So that immediately I was like, oh my God, we're all real people and these are my real friends and it's not just, virtual. And then a couple years later, I was lucky enough to be able to go to a retreat hosted by narrators for other narrators. And I met a bunch of other people in person there too. And those two things really gave me like a solid foundation that then I could continue communicating with those people long distance and maintain those relationships. And it also helped me feel more empowered to then, when I did meet someone virtually, like André, I think we probably connected online first or through other friends. I felt more empowered to be like, hey, I'm going to be in New York. Can we hang out? Can we do whatever? And then like turn that virtual connection into a in-person one.
It's funny hearing you talk about APAC because maybe that should be my answer because it is when I first met people in person. But and this might just be my personality, having so many people there who I'd never met before actually made me feel like more of an outsider than a member of a community. Like I did not feel like I had broken my way into the community yet at that point. For me, it was actually being a part of PANA's DEI committee, where every month I got to talk to André and Gail and Deepti and several other wonderful people. And it was the first time I found myself in a space, a virtual space, where we were really encouraged to speak up and speak our mind and share our feelings. And it wasn't about the craft. It was about our experience as people moving through the world and how that informs our work. And those conversations made me feel like I was a part of a community. And it is there's a direct line from that committee to this podcast. And that took years. I started in 2016 and we did that in 2021?
Yeah.
Was when that started. So it took a while to really feel like I broke in. And part of that is geographic because I'm way out here in the middle of nowhere, back when nobody was in the middle of nowhere. And now people are flocking to the middle of nowhere. So,
True.
Andi, I'm curious from your perspective, like what changes have you witnessed through the years about how communities are built in our little corner of the acting world? And because, we've talked about like these virtual spaces, like that is something that used to not exist to the same degree. So, how have those things changed as you've watched?
Yeah, well, I got into this in about 2009, 2010. I was already doing voiceover, but I made a very serious commitment to find my way into audiobook narration, which at that time just seemed like walking around a silo looking for the door. Like, how I know that there's a way in there, but how do you get in there? And before I came into things, home studios were not all that common. So the community that I came into all were people who knew each other from the Film Center building in New York or going into Audible in person or going into PRH, which was at that time just Random House, in LA in person or coming here to Brilliance. I'm in West Michigan right now. When you go to Brilliance now, there's this long hallway. I think there are 12 different studios, and they all used to be filled with narrators and engineers and sometimes directors. And the lunchroom was this like really wonderful place. And the Brilliance people and the narrators would sometimes go see each other socially after hours because they'd flew the narrators here. So there was a lot of high touch networking before I came into it, but I was in the middle of nowhere. I was in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, 2 hours from any decent airport. And so I found that I had to travel. And I like traveling. I'm familiar with New York. I got to know LA. Those are funny stories because I did a bunch of things like, oh dear, you know. But after a while, the New York people assumed I was from LA, and the LA people assumed I was from New York, and I just didn't ever really say much about that. And the online space that I came into was early Facebook, where we all knew that we needed to watch the way we interacted in the online spaces because we were very likely to see each other in person very soon. And it really anchored those discussions in professionalism, civility, not that we didn't have some laughs and get a little, ribbled at times, because we absolutely did, because we're audiobook narrators, hello. But there wasn't that sense of like flamethrower and leave that can happen
And are
in
you
online
implying
spaces.
that that's how social media can be nowadays?
I
Is that
mean,
what you're...
I've heard.
Yeah, well, and I mean, it takes it in a direction I didn't initially expect, because I know that the technology has changed, but you bring up an interesting point too, just about knowing that you were in a group of people that you would likely see is also a product of there only being a certain number of people in those groups.
Mhm.
There are so many of us now. I don't go into the groups very often, but like those who go into them, like, are they at 10,000 members yet?
So a couple
More?
are approaching, probably between 5 and 10 is the average, yeah.
So yeah, you can throw a grenade and walk away, because you can knock out 1,000 of your colleagues and still have plenty of people to talk to. So just the sheer number of people who are available to create smaller groups means that we don't always have to be so careful about what we say, or concerned about how what we say online could come back to us in the future.
In my opinion, it's a little bit similar to before COVID, when almost all of the auditions in LA were in person. And then back when I was doing theater in the very beginning, when I was in New York, and you're just in this room packed like sardines, right? And waiting to go. And there was this thing where certain people would try to do like the psych out, you know,
Mm.
like it's a thing. It happens. You know what I mean? So it either happens before, while you're in there, they're asking you a bunch of questions, like trying to, giving a lot of information that you didn't ask for. Um, and then the other one is like the exit from the room. You know what I mean? Like you exit
Mm-hmm.
and you're all like, yeah. And you're all in this actory mode of like, I'm amazing. And this was awesome.
Mm-hmm.
To purposefully and hopefully discourage the people coming after you, who are literally in chairs in the hallway, like right outside. They heard you. They know
Mm-hmm.
exactly what you did, but it's like this thing they had to put on. So, with the thumb thugging, as I like to call it, of, people just like typing stuff and like, boom, just driving off. I, I feel like that's a social media thing. It's a little bit like old fashioned prank calling. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know exactly where that comes from, but sometimes people not knowing exactly who you are, especially if you're doing it anonymously, as you can do in some of the Facebook groups, or you just don't have real information, your user, whatever, lots of numbers. It just makes it easy to say whatever you want. And sometimes being controversial just to be controversial, because that entertains you, maybe. It's just different.
And it's interesting you say that too, because I feel like I hear so consistently, especially from, like in other kinds of voiceover spaces, from folks who also do like stage and camera, that it's worlds apart, that audiobooks included, for some reason, voiceover is just much more welcoming than, other forms of acting communities.
Yeah.
And I think like I've often heard it attributed to like, oh, voiceover is always growing. Like there's so much work to go around. There's no sense of competition. And I don't know if that's I don't know if that would withstand the test of time. I feel like it under addresses other aspects that have created a perhaps more intentionally giving community than just the nature of like, I can bring someone in and mentor them and it's not going to impact my work and what I'm considered for.
You know what? I think part of that is because the commitment level today to do any voice work is much, much larger than anything else because the majority of it has to be done in your home. So getting that home studio situation together or whatever arrangements you're making, sharing a booth with someone or whatever that is, that's a huge commitment as opposed to getting in your car or getting in front of your phone, and doing a self-tape at home. It's not the same. And so I think people are just a little bit more grounded maybe in making the decision to do their own work. So helping someone else achieve that is not as threatening as say, someone that's trying to do something live on stage or on camera, I'm thinking.
I wonder how much of it is also one of my favorite things about audiobooks and voiceover, which is not just the amount of jobs available, because that can fluctuate, but the amount of jobs that each person is available for, because this is taken away, because appearance is taken out of the equation. When I'm working in film or television, the kind of roles that I can apply for and audition for is fairly narrow. It's like people, it's people within a certain age range, a certain look. I think I've talked about this on the podcast before. I'm really tall and not super skinny. And so my type is like this big. And so I'm competing for this many roles with like a million other people who have very similar things. So that, it's not like, if you look at like all the theater roles and all the film roles versus all the VO roles, maybe it's very similar, but the roles that I can do on theater and film are this big, and the roles I can do in voiceover is this big. So here I'm competing with like this small group of people, and it's like, and if you get it, then I don't get it, and we're screwed. But here I'm like, my competition is everybody, and therefore nobody. So great.
Yeah, interesting.
And that's not to say I didn't have an amazing community when I was doing lots of theater, because I did. That was also the Chicago theater community, at least when I was doing it, was incredible. But I don't feel that same intense competition that I might have otherwise.
Yeah, it's interesting that lack of competition is something that would so inform our ability to create community. Individually, what do you feel like you get out of being a part of the narrator community? Why does it serve you? Why is it better than just being Andi or André or Deanna or Lindsey sitting in your booth doing your own thing and not interacting with other people?
I mean, I will say it is everything. I couldn't do this job if I didn't have a solid community in the audiobook world, because it is so incredibly lonely. You are by yourself all the time. And, most books these days don't even have a director or an engineer. You are truly, truly alone. And so you're not collaborating with anybody. It's all by yourself. And so I would lose my mind if I couldn't also connect with other people creatively. The number, almost daily, I'm voice memoing, texting, contacting other narrators that I formed friendships with over the years to vent about, to crow about a scene I just did that felt so good, or to vent about something, or to ask about how should I approach this, or what are you doing with this, or I feel insecure about that. And other narrators come to me with the same, excitement or fear or whatever. And just being able to talk to each other is everything. I couldn't do this job without it.
Group education too, I think, is another part of it that which you touched on a little bit, like how do I do this thing? Because there is no university that offers a class on audiobook narration, as far as I know. There is now? Where?
Yes. UCLA.
Okay. So I stand corrected. They are out there. But it's still very few. The education of becoming an audiobook narrator is really up to you to go out and seek information. And one of the best ways to gather information is to ask questions from people who have done it, who are doing it. And that's where that sense of community, where we are willing to actually share that information matters.
Before we gathered, I just thought, I wonder what happens in 2024 in November when you Google how to become an audiobook narrator. And there's so much information, it's almost as bad a problem as no information. Because then I'm thrown back on, well, who do I listen to? Am I going to just drive in circles, or is this going to get me somewhere? And for me, when I was researching at the very beginning of my career, I researched all the time because I was excited about it. So in my spare time, I would just look stuff up and read stuff. And when you start to see the same names popping up over and over and over, and that gives a sense of almost like a constellation of like, oh, I get a sense of the shape of this thing now. There's this person, there's this person. A lot of people talk about this person's book or whatever, or this studio and this magazine and this website. Okay. Now, I'm seeing how the community refers to itself amongst itself. And now I can kind of pick a point of entry and see what I learn.
I am curious about that. Once you've gone through the process of learning and you are never fully on the other side, but you have enough experience to where you can start being a person who helps others. I think we're all in that place. Did you feel a sense of obligation to pay it forward? Was that like anything that was instilled in you, or did you feel it naturally? Or are you like, no, I don't help people? Anybody want to stand up for no, I don't help people?
I mean, it's actually a choice that leaves you a whole lot of free time, I will say.
Yeah, it certainly would. None of us who are currently doing a podcast about the industry of audiobook narration are saying, no, I'm not helping people.
I love free time and I hate helping. That's why I'm here. No, but I will say, like, and maybe this is just me, like, because I got that nerd, strong in me. But like, I actually, one of my favorite things is, I hope this doesn't sound like weird or conceited, but like, I love when I get to be like an expert in something. And like you said, expert because you're constantly learning, but like, it is such a source of joy for me when I legitimately know something about something and can tell somebody else and can like educate them, whether it's a topic not related to audiobooks that I'm just passionate about, like, and I can info dump for a little bit, or it's audiobooks. Like, and I used to do a lot of teaching in my life before when I was working a million jobs in Chicago. And I loved that too. I love like helping somebody understand a concept or helping somebody like seeing that idea sort of spark. And like, so I was so excited when I got to the point where I could like sign up to be an APA mentor for the first time and do stuff like that. Like when I felt like I had legitimately learned enough to be helpful. It was such a joy. I was like, yes, now I get to like talk to somebody about this thing I'm really interested in. So I was just excited about it.
Yeah. I'll say I don't find myself on that level of joy for helping others. Just being honest, like, fair. But I did feel a very deep sense of gratitude for the people who are willing to help me and never asked for anything in return. And therefore a sense of duty. Some may call it obligation, but like a sense of, I was honor bound to pay that forward. That if somebody came to me and asked for help, I could not refuse them or say, I will only help you if you pay X amount of dollars for a certain level of expertise, the same level that was like afforded to me before people started saying, well, now you really need to get coaching. Like that's a specific thing to coach about. But basic questions about like, is it okay to email a producer directly, even if you've never worked with them? Or, how many hours a day are you supposed to get done? Like just basic questions like that. There were people who were there to answer those questions. I don't know that I've talked about this on the podcast, and I'm going to put it out in the world just in case anybody doesn't know what an amazing human being Travis Baldry is.
Yeah.
But before I was a full-time narrator, I was doing a full-time job and I had a book to finish, and it was literally Thanksgiving Day. And I was working on a book, and I started having trouble with my DAW, and I knew he used the same DAW. And so I emailed him. I did not expect him to reply on Thanksgiving. I was just working on Thanksgiving, so I sent him an email. He replied that day and walked me through fixing the problem.
Mm.
And so it's that level of like, I will give of myself and I will help you because you're a colleague in need, that like I feel a very deep sense to pay that forward.
And to be clear, it's exactly what you're talking about, where there's a big difference between somebody who has done a lot of footwork on their own, who has Googled, who has done a bit of research, who's getting into this, and then has a question like, wait, how many finished hours a day do you do? Or wait, I've been working with this DAW and I troubleshot, but now I'm running into problems. Can you help? That is, and I think that there are so many people in this community who will jump to those, to help people with that. That's so different from like, hey, how do you get into audiobooks? Like, hey, I see you do audiobooks. Like, I read my kids at night. Like that's a different. I'm not excited to hear from those people, but I'm excited to hear for the folks who put a little bit of time in first.
Yeah, so they can ask a higher order question.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back a little bit to what Deanna, I think, was starting to talk about. So it's time to open the box. Because as many times as like really wonderful people have answered my questions, there have also been times when I've been mostly an observer in those groups where somebody asks for help and there's one or two people who explain to them why they should just give up. Or if you don't know that, then there's no point in you being here. They're sprinkled among even the best of us. But we also have an obligation, I think, to keep our community open. But as there are so many people flowing into the community, sometimes it's hard to make everybody feel like they're part of a large group. So we start to create smaller groups. So, Deanna, is that a little bit what you were starting to talk about earlier? That sense of like, maybe not this place?
It kind of sort of is, except I can be a little bit more specific without being too specific that I don't throw somebody under the bus. So just really early on, I had already done like 6 months worth of training, and I had joined the APA. I had been on Clubhouse, since kind of like the beginning of when everybody who was doing audiobooks was very active on there. And literally we were on there every day, all day, like on and off between like 9 o'clock in the morning Eastern time until like 6 o'clock West Coast time, right? And so I knew people, I knew what people were doing. I knew what I wanted to start with as a narrator. Like I had my goals in place. And after my initial education, I even had my first demos. I was already on rosters. I was already auditioning. And that was before reaching out. That literally was just doing the work myself, going on people's websites and figuring out how to tell them who I was, right? In one of the Facebook groups, there was a mentorship program. So I signed up for this mentorship program, and the mentors who are volunteering choose who they want to mentor. And the mentor that I ended up getting literally told me to get off of one specific roster because I didn't have any books and I didn't belong there. And I needed a certain number of titles in order to do, which I knew was old school because I'd already been coaching for 6 months straight. Full time, y'all, full time, because it was during COVID. And so I sat there for a minute and I was really disappointed. I was like, you've not seen my website. You've not listened to any of the work that I've done, but it's your automatic response to respond to someone that you do not know and just tell them that they're not ready. Forget that I've been an actor for more than 30 years and I've worked in other mediums, including voiceover. And I have a full home studio and I've already been vetted by one of the largest producers of audiobooks in America. But that's what you're going to tell me. And that was like my first moment of, oh, so everybody is not down for everybody in this. I was like, oh, it is a lot like being in the acting world where people may have been hurt by someone else the exact same way and they just perpetuate it and place it on other people. And because of the experience that I had, because of the people I was already coaching, multiple people that I was coaching with at that time, I already knew who Andy was then. I was like, I don't have to take that. I don't have to take that as gospel because I already know what it is. So I'm just going to let that go. And that day I started a list. And I was like, these are people I think I need to be careful with until I know them better. Because I don't know if they're going to take the effort to get to know me better. I was like, so I'm not going to put my trust in them. We'll see how that goes. So that was kind of like the thing, like in the box, it's like, you're new, you know nothing. Like that was the first box that I was put into. And so, do you know what I'm saying? It's like, people are people. And
Yeah,
so I think,
they will
yeah,
find a way to build a wall if they can
yes, yes. And
sometimes.
that's what I'm saying. So I believe that sometimes because to what Lindsey was saying, this work is so lonely, um, according to where that other person is coming from and dropping, you know, the comments or like the questions I can't stand are, well, it doesn't really matter, but did y'all know about this? You know, and it's like scandal. And people are like, ah, and they never come back. They just drop it and like just are waiting. Do you know what I mean? So like people who are hurting like to have that camaraderie, you know, people who are like in a manic state, they're like, I want people to be manic with me. Yeah. So what, and I seriously, like, I'm like, delete, delete, delete. That's all I can do.
Mhm.
But I've noticed it more so, like saying like the last year, I was like, so what? And I think I know what's happening. I think, I think we all know what's happening. And so
Yeah.
it's
Well,
manifesting itself in this way.
um, getting back to that first lobster bake, while I met so many incredible people and I didn't know who I was meeting, like I met Deb Dion, she's coming in from a swim, right? And she was so nice and we're talking and I whatever. And I found out, oh, that's Deb Dion. Got it. you know? And and at the same event though, as welcoming as everybody was and as amazing people as I met, there was one person that everyone seemed to be quite deferential to, and another person was going to take a group photo. Hey, everybody get together, let's take a photo. And this person boxed me out of the photo by putting their arm around somebody, which resulted in me being behind everybody and thus not in that photo, right? And I'm going, okay, like you said, Deanna, I know what this is. And I'm just going to file that away and keep that for my information. And for years, every time I saw this person, they would get my name wrong or kind of be dismissive or whatever. And then there was an industry event where we were put on the same level. And then the pandemic. And then the first in-person event in New York after the pandemic, I found myself talking to this person for a long time. And this person really unburdened themselves to me and had been so lonely and had been just so, having such a hard time with everything. And it was as though none of the rest of it ever happened. And I let go of it all. And it really taught me that just because someone is established in this or seems to us to be like where we want to be and they don't have any problems, they don't have to hustle, whatever, it doesn't mean that they've dealt with their own stuff.
What a great reminder to not be a dick in return.
It's hard sometimes.
Yeah.
You get
Yeah.
stung, you're stung. But yeah, I guess what I took from that is like, who do I want to be when I show up in community spaces? I don't want to be that because that is, classic hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
and somebody else's fear and scarcity, fear of scarcity. Sometimes when a whole lot, like when during the pandemic, when so many new narrators came into things, I saw people that have been around since I've been around, um, reacting out of fear, you know, with so many people coming in, how will we have enough jobs?
Yeah. It really makes me think about the implications, I think, of any community space I've been in and what actually defines belonging in those spaces. Thinking about like I went to a really small college. We had 400 people at my school, and I could move kind of from space to space and be around a lot of people and think like, oh, look at us, we're all having a good time, and identify kind of the person who's outside of that. And I think like a lot of it is also about values, and that ties to our personal experiences. I think in the way that you, Andy, and you, Deanna, have shared. Like, there were one of the moments for me where I kind of felt like divided and plucked out. This was a fairly robust online conversation, and people were, to me, surprisingly, very divided down the middle of this. So I'll reference this generally because I don't think it singles anybody out. The conversations around the kind of new, well, in certain contracts, the new SAG-AFTRA policy requiring after 3 contracts that you join in order to be hired by that same production company again. And a lot of people woke up one morning and had done 50 books for a company, and the company said, "You have to join SAG-AFTRA in order for us to hire you again." Shocking for folks. Some people were really divided. They really did not believe that SAG-AFTRA owed non-union narrators anything. Some people really felt for the non-union narrators who were kind of thrust with this big question. For me, it was interesting because I had to, like, there were a lot of people who did not agree with my perspective on it, who I really respect in this space, who I look up to and continue to look up to. And I had to sit back and recognize that even though we disagree on this thing, there are actually a lot of values that we share. And that's the reason that that sense and standard of community has existed and continued to exist even after that discussion in that space, right? I do think that, like, to what Kirt described about even just those kind of like someone comes to you with that higher order question about audiobook narration, you're there, you have a easy answer, you want to share back that time because someone shared that time back with you. I think that is a sort of internal value as well. I think that's a reflection of not only how you've moved through the world and healed as a person, but also what you want to seed in the world. I think, like, being able to go onto Facebook and people are tagging each other to be cast in this project that someone's shared details about. I have gone to, I've needed narrator names for various reasons, and I've reached out to producers, and they're happy to like send a list of recommendations. Those kinds of interactions that, like, so and so sends me Lindsey's name, and Lindsey is never going to know that we had this exchange, that someone is thinking positively of her. But it does seem like value seeding is really important in sharing a community space. And I feel like the scale impacts that. When you have so many people in the space that, it's kind of, there's no kind of like shared reason for coming in except that acx.com exists, for example. It's harder to navigate kind of like what those values are. But I find much more kind of like consistency and intricacy and thoughtfulness in the groups for like full-time narrators, as opposed to the kind of range of things that might happen in some other spaces. And those spaces will all give different kinds of positive, great things, right, for people who need them. But it does feel like it would be hard to be in a space where, and I think I have been in those spaces before, where yes, we share something, we share an experience, we share whatever it is, but those values aren't aligned for us. We don't actually seem to see each other across the work, and so maybe I think that's for me kind of what I'm seeing and loving so far in audiobooks is it seems like people want audiobooks to go well. It seems like people want narrators to thrive. It seems like people want, these stories to be told, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't know how easy that is to like do intentionally all the time, but it does seem to be fortunate that we've landed in a space where that's happening.
I'd like to add on to what you were saying, André. That quality that exists when you don't have to explain. Like, explain why, because we're in community and we're doing it and we understand why. Like, why is that difficult? Why is that a challenge? Like, why is that even a question? Do you know what I mean? It's like, you just, when you're in a space where people just get you, whether you're in alignment on every detail of it, the broader scope of why the thing is and why it's important and why it has meaning and why you even want to be involved in it. And not having to ask that question about what are you doing next. I've never been asked that by another audiobook narrator because
That's
they
such a good
know
point.
I don't know because they know that they don't know. We're like, hey, seat of our pants. Like, it's an audition. I'm on ACX. I'm talking to authors. It's going to come. Do you know what I mean? But we don't have to have that discussion because we know, right? And that's like a great foundation of community where you just don't have to explain yourself and you can literally be in whatever audiobook moment you're in and you have the space to do it. And I think that's the biggest difference if I were to choose one thing.
Yeah, and I think to Andre's point, I love because what you're describing is sort of that idea of like being the change you want to see in the world, right? Of leading by example, of like saying, I want my audiobook community to behave like this, so I'm going to behave like this. I'm going to behave professionally and with kindness and with generosity and like and and hope to get that in return and like sort of model that. And I think also it highlights the importance of making these personal connect, like the community is stronger the more small group or one-on-one connections we make, because then if somebody is if somebody is in conflict in the greater community or whatever, there's space and there's grace for like calling people in or talking to people one-on-one. Like it's so much easier to wrangle that stuff and to resolve that stuff peacefully and kindly if somebody can be like, hey, we've been friends for a long time, can we talk about this? Rather than like some sort of group coming after somebody or whatever, or, just being able to like, if you have a real personal relationship, it's much easier to discuss things than if you're two strangers disagreeing. But to that end, I think it's also important and also healthy to establish like smaller niche groups within that community where, like Deanna said, you can have that sort of simpatico discussion where without necessarily, the larger community obviously should be as open and inclusive to everybody as possible. But sometimes it can be nice to niche down to be like, hey, I know that all the people in this smaller group share my values or share my life experience, right? Know what it is to, to go through the industry, in a certain gender or body or race or whatever, and we don't have to talk about it. Like we don't have to translate for people outside the group. We can just get right to the meat of it in this smaller group, which then I think translates to the larger community as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, those moments are also really special. And I mean, they stick with me. And even somebody as salty as me is happy when he sees it happening for other people. Like my last trip to New York, André and I had dinner with some other narrators where it was like, if a bomb falls in this building, who's narrating the queer YA books for the next year? Who's doing it? we're all dead. And like I saw a similar post of that where it was like a very niche group of narrators where it's like, well, hope nothing happens in that building because like they're so identified with that work, and then they find each other, and it's not at all surprising when you get along.
the first APAC that I went to that year, the industry produced like 11,000 audiobooks total. And we're up in the 70s now, I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
But I was there and somebody leaned in my ear and said, when you think about it, the entire critical mass of the audiobook industry is down here in a corner of the basement of the Javits Center right now. And that's talking publishers and casting people and narrators. And literally, there were 3 sessions going on at the same time. So 3 rooms full of people. And that was it. And some people hanging out in the hall because they were over it.
Well, and it just that is so different now, because at any given point in time, even when there's 1,000 of us in one space, so many more of us are not there when we gather in person than could ever be actually present. And so that's why building communities across the internet, I think, is also a really important goal for us to do. And that, I think, probably does require a little bit more intention, a little bit more creating of space for people to gather, which is something, Andy, that you've done intentionally. Like, what was the impetus for that?
Well, it was during the pandemic. How many stories begin that way?
Exactly.
Yes.
And the summer of 2020, I decided to just offer a free series of group classes on Facebook and just like host a group and have, I don't remember how frequently we met. But we had topics that we are going to discuss, and we met over the summer. It was like summer school. And then after the summer, well, like as the summer was concluding, there was a sense of like, what now? We would like some more of this. And I sort of took note of that, and um, I started an email list, and I started to email that list about um, different coaching opportunities and group opportunities, and sharing what I could share that was applicable to the group of people that I had gotten to know over the summer. But at the same time, I started to learn about online courses and the communities you could build around an online course. And so I initially focused on building courses, and Narrator.life launched in early 2021 with about 7 of us on the faculty. I approached people that I knew had university level teaching experience or professional conservatory teaching experience under their belt, because I felt that it was just as important to know how to teach a person a thing as to know how to do the thing. Because as we know, just because you can do it doesn't mean that you can help someone else find their way to it. Because you're not going to, people have all different learning styles. We are adults learning things, so that's different. And sometimes learning how to listen or ask a well-timed question is just as important as sort of putting in content, right? So educate literally means to draw out of a person, not to put in a person, which I always try to remember. So we created these courses, and then we had some live courses, the open studios that would last for 4 sessions. Some of you have taken the open studios. They would be genre focused or problem focused, dealing with dialogue or whatever. And we started to learn about the community that was drawn to Narrator.life, that people didn't want self-study online courses about audiobooks. Big surprise. We're all alone all the time. They wanted the live things where they actually got to know a small group of their peers, or like Ronnie and I created the Palm Springs retreat, which maxes out at 12 participants, and we go deep for 3 days. Instead of having like superficial with 1,000 people, we got 12 people, and by the end of that weekend, they are there for each other. They stay in touch. I don't know how it was in your cohort, Deanna, but um, it's we've heard back from participants, more importantly, that it is transformative. And so what I've done since January, I moved the website from a WordPress LearnDash platform that was all about offering online courses asynchronously so people could do self-study. I moved it onto a platform called Mighty Networks, which is a community hosting platform. And these are private communities, so it's not a public social media with advertising where your focus is pulled in 50 million different directions. And what is really cool is I just looked before we got on. There are 129 people in there now, and some faculty and a lot of participants. But there have started to be some interest groups forming, like neurodivergent narrators who want to chat amongst themselves, or narrators who are also trying their hand at writing right now. And every Thursday morning, we go live on a Zoom, butts in the chair, and we get some words in, and we've been writing. So I'm really excited to see that the community is starting to do that thing where it's got a critical mass where people pull somebody in because they're enjoying what's happening there. And so you're not going to see a lot of um, advertising about it. We're an APA sponsor, happy to do that. We have an Instagram account, but we don't want it to be all 40,000 narrators who have an ACX profile.
I think what you're getting at is something that we've talked around a lot in this conversation, is just the sheer volume of narrators that exist in the world now. You almost by necessity need to localize things, and one way to do that is a network where you have to invest a little bit to be a part of it. And the trade-off for that is you don't have to worry about selling ads, and we don't have to worry about splitting our attention when we're in that space, because we've invested in it. It's ours, you know? And which is not to say that there aren't other times when it's really valuable for folks who are doing this work full time and have been doing it for 10 years to mix with those who are just dipping their toe in the water and want to learn a little bit more. There are times and places for those interactions, for that community to exist together as well. But that doesn't mean it's wrong to sometimes say, like, we're going to self-select down a little bit and have a different conversation over here.
Well, and there's something magical about having a cohort of peers that can change and shift and whatever over time, but like having people who are at a similar, because I also learn from people who have been doing this years and years longer than me, and I love connecting with those people and being inspired by those people. I love connecting with brand new narrators who are doing their first few books and are super excited. But there's something really special about people who are at a similar place in their careers, because we just have so much to talk about and so much to connect on because we're having very similar experiences, and it helps to feel less alone in whatever spot you're at on your journey.
Yep. And when I was going through, I have a master's in education. And so I remember learning in one of my classes that in Japan, the ethos that is taught in Japanese classrooms is once you understand something, you don't just sit there with your hands folded. You look around and see who else needs help. Because if you understand it, then you are in a position to help a peer. And so I guess I thought, I wish that we were inculcated with that same thing instead of it being, I've got mine, I'm finished, I'm just going to sit here. I really like the idea that we start at a certain level, but, and we need those who are ahead of us that we learn from. But when we get a few rungs up the ladder, we are seeing who's coming behind us and extending a hand, I'll help you up. At the same time, it is a bit of salmon swimming upstream. The conditions themselves test us, and we do want to see somebody keep showing up, keep trying, keep doing their own work, because that is the swimming upstream that we've all had to do. And I think that there is a respect in our community for people who put in the time.
I love that. I think that's a great place to bring this conversation to a close. Thank you, Andi, so much for joining us and sharing your expertise and also your values with us.
I felt very welcome. Thanks so much.
So happy we finally had you on, and we've mentioned your name so many times, like more times than have even made it into the final podcast episodes. Like you come up a lot. So this was very special to have you with us.
I'm blushing now. You can't see because it's dark.
I mean, I think all of us have worked with you at one point or another. So it's like we're all just Andy stans. We're like, yes, Andy taught me this, and I'm going to share it with you. Which is another thing, by the way, that you have modeled so brilliantly. Before I let this go, I often used to joke about it during those Clubhouse days because I was coaching with you at the same time. And so I would tell people who weren't showing up to those Friday afternoon Clubhouse calls, I was like, go there now, because I have literally paid for time with Andy in the morning and had her share wisdom with me. And then later that afternoon, she told the same thing to a bunch of people for free. And I'm not mad about it at all, because I think that's the way it should be. You know, like, so go get this free information that she is just giving out. Do it, because you never know if that little nugget that came up because I talked to her earlier in the day might benefit you. Go do it. So thank you for being such an example of like being willing to be free and help people without always saying, well, you gotta achieve a certain level before you find out what I have to say. So thank you for that. So thank you for joining us at the Narrator Roundtable. If you want to join the conversation, find us on social media or visit our website, narratorroundtable.com, to submit a question or topic of discussion for a future episode. What is on your mind? We would like to talk about it. Come on. The Narrator Roundtable is produced and hosted by André Santana, Deanna Anthony, Gail Shalan, Kirt Graves, and Lindsey Dorcus. All copyrighted material is shared with permission. Music and sound effects are licensed through Storyblocks Audio. All opinions shared are those of the individuals and do not reflect the positions or policies of any company or organization with which they happen to be associated.